Our next speaker is Gabriel Greenberg-Pines. The energetic intake of web building spiders is determined by spider size, not web geometry.
All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it looks wonderful.
Awesome. All right, so my name is Gabriel Greenberg-Pines. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, and my presentation is titled Energy Intake in Web Building Spiders is Determined by Mass, not Spider Geometry, or not Web Geometry. So as organisms grow, their body parts and processes scale at different rates, and many fundamental biological and physiological processes scale allometrically with body size. Metabolic rate per unit mass declines somewhere between the -1/3 and -1/4 power of body size, depending on a variety of potential factors, as illustrated in the graph on the right. And in addition to bodies, we know that many spiders also have webs with a diversity of geometrical arrangements. Spider webs are critical because they capture the energy needed to meet the metabolic demands of body size. And as I illustrated in the previous slides, body size more or less determines metabolism, and metabolic rate per unit mass should scale somewhere between the -1/3 and -1/4 power of mass. In addition, as metabolism is essentially the rate of energy uptake, allocation, and transformation, it should determine the rate of energy intake an organism needs to meet the energetic demands of metabolism. Thus, presumably, biomass capture rate per unit mass should scale with a similar slope of metabolic rate per unit mass. And we know one of the incredible things about spiders is they build prey capture webs to extract energy from the external environment. One of the most critical parts of prey capture webs is the prey capture surface area. However, it's unclear how prey capture surface area per unit mass should scale with mass. We also know that prey capture surface area should influence several critical prey capture metrics, including prey capture rate per unit mass and average prey size per unit mass. However, it's unknown how these variables should relate to mass. But at the end of the day, they should all go back to meet the rate of energy intake that an organism needs to meet the demands of metabolism. Something that we do know is that spider webs scale at rates determined by their geometry. For example, in two-dimensional webs, the prey capture surface area is proportional to a linear dimension squared. In addition, the web volume is also proportional to a linear dimension squared. This means that prey capture surface area per unit of web volume should be constant as web volume increases. On the other hand, three-dimensional webs also have a prey capture surface area that's proportional to a linear dimension squared, whereas web volume should be proportional to a linear dimension cubed. And this can create problems. This means that prey capture surface area per unit of web volume should decline to approximately the -1/3 power as a function of web volume. So our study sought to ask the question, how do web geometry and body size affect the scaling relationships of energy intake among web building spiders? And our hypothesis was that body size should determine the overall amounts of energy spiders need, whereas web geometry should determine the scaling relationships that facilitate the acquisition of that energy. So we designed a study and carried it out at Pacific Spirit Regional Park in Vancouver, British Columbia from June through September 2020. We performed observations at 8 sites throughout the park on approximately 560 web building spiders of 3 geometries that covered approximately 4 orders of magnitude of body size. Each sampling period was approximately 2 days, where we observed spiders for a range of 6 to 16 hours. And we sampled each site twice, once in early and late summer to try to account for seasonality. We observed prey capture rates, prey sizes, and taxonomic order of prey, as well as quantifying the dimensions of webs. We also took measurements on spider size and the weight of webs. We also attempted to incorporate some taxonomic diversity into our study. For orb weavers, we sampled 3 families, Araneidae, Euloboridae, and Pectronathidae, and 6 genera. For tangles, we sampled 1 family, Therideidae, and 3 genera. And for sheet and tangle building spiders, we sampled 1 family, Linophiidae, and 3 genera. For our statistical methods, we used a set of generalized linear mixed effects models with a basic model structure, including a response variable and 4 fixed effects: web geometry, mass, the interaction between web geometry and mass, and temperature, and 1 random effect, genus, although we're currently working on incorporating a phylogenetic correction into our analyses. So let's get into the results for the geometrical scaling of spider webs. We found that prey capture surface area to volume ratios decline as three-dimensional webs grow, while two-dimensional webs remain constant. In the graph on the right, you'll see capture surface area to volume on the y-axis and volume on the x-axis. In the orb facet, you'll see that the capture surface area to volume ratio is approximately constant, while in the sheet and tangle building spiders, it declines to approximately the negative 1/3 power. This is consistent with our predictions based on the geometry of the webs as illustrated in the panels on the left. And this is critical because as web volume is proportional to web weight or the costs of the web, and the prey capture rate is proportional to the prey capture surface area, this means that in three-dimensional webs, as volume and web weight increase, a spider may capture less prey per unit of web cost, potentially making a more costly web less effective at obtaining prey. So you might be asking yourself, how can organisms overcome three-dimensional scaling challenges? Well, one potential solution is that the scaling issue is just not a problem. Perhaps, for example, prey capture surface area per unit mass declines at a similar or a lower slope than metabolic rate per unit mass. On the other hand, perhaps webs change shape as they grow. For example, maybe the height to width ratio might increase as a function of the width, and the web elongates. A third option is that perhaps spiders capture larger prey. For example, average prey size may increase as a function of volume. And lastly, maybe there's just an increase in prey capture efficiency. For example, maybe silk stickiness or something along those lines increases as volume increases. We found that sheet and tangle building spiders maintain a constant prey capture surface area per unit mass. In the graph on the right, you'll see prey capture surface area per unit mass on the y-axis and mass on the x-axis. In the first facet, you see that orbs are not limited by volume and are presumably growing their webs to a size that meets their metabolic requirements, as they potentially can just expand them to meet their needs. And we kind of consider this the standard for the expected slope of the relationship, which is negative 0.64. On the other hand, we see that sheet and tangles may be compensating above what would be potentially needed given the metabolic scaling illustrated in the figure on the left, but that tangles are apparently doing worse at a slope of negative 0.86. The fact that the slope is steeper than predicted by metabolic scaling in orbs and tangles could be that larger webs capture larger insects, perhaps compensating for the declining prey capture rates per unit mass. However, we find that sheet and tangles capture larger prey as web size increases, illustrated in the graph on the right with the green box. However, tangles actually decline, average prey size declining as a function of volume. On the other hand, neither web type increases the height to width ratio as a function of width, illustrated on the bottom panel on the right, and tangles actually decline. Okay, so let's get into the results for web geometry and energy intake. We found that prey capture rates per unit mass decline with steeper slopes than capture surface area per unit mass in sheet and tangle webs. And this potentially indicates that webs are not perfectly efficient devices. In the graph on the left, you'll see prey capture surface area per unit mass as a function of mass on the x-axis. If you zone in on the bottom graph, you'll see that, again, as I illustrated previously, sheet and tangles have essentially a constant slope. However, in the graph on the right, you'll see that prey capture rate per unit mass declines to the negative 0.93 slope as a function of mass in sheet and tangle builders, potentially indicating their webs are not all that efficient in capturing prey. In addition, we find that prey capture rates per unit mass are higher in orb webs, illustrated in the red, than tangle webs, illustrated in blue, and that tangle webs have a steeper slope than orbs. We also found that average prey size per unit mass is higher in sheet and tangle webs than orbs, as illustrated in the graph on the right. You'll see average prey size per unit mass on the y-axis and mass on the x-axis. The green regression line indicates sheet and tangles, and the red regression line indicates orbs. Despite this, there's no difference in the slopes between web geometries, which all decline to a power of negative 0.86 of mass. At the end of the day, though, we find that energy intake per unit mass is determined by mass and not web geometry, despite these differential effects of web geometry on prey capture rates per unit mass and average prey size per unit mass. And presumably this relationship reflects the negative slope of biomass per unit mass, or excuse me, presumably the negative slope of biomass per unit mass reflects the lower metabolic rate per unit mass of larger spiders. However, we find that the slope is considerably steeper. So the question remains, why does it decline? Why does the slope of biomass captured per unit mass as a function of mass decline at a much steeper slope than metabolic rate per unit mass as a function of mass? So in conclusion, we show that three-dimensional webs do face scaling challenges in their surface area to volume ratios, declining as volume increases, and that sheet and tangle webs may overcome these challenges by maintaining a constant prey capture surface area per unit mass as a function of mass, and potentially capturing larger prey as well. Third, we show that prey capture rates per unit mass decline with steeper slopes than prey capture surface area per unit mass in sheet and tangle webs, perhaps illustrating they are less efficient prey capture devices. Fourth, orbs not limited by volume do maintain similar slopes for prey capture surface area per unit mass, prey capture rates per unit mass, and biomass intake per unit mass. And again, they are a standard for thinking about the relationship for prey capture surface area per unit mass. In the end, although web geometry does influence prey capture metrics, we find that mass determines the energy intake of web building spiders. So several future questions remain. One, if at all, how are tangles compensating for three-dimensional scaling issues? And second, why is the slope of biomass per unit mass steeper than that predicted for metabolic rate per unit mass? I'd like to acknowledge that this project took place on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and that Rob Bennett ID'd all the specimens for that at the Royal BC Museum. I'd like to thank the Aviles Lab for their help and support, Robin Glover, Anna Carla Parra, and Ryan Kwok for helping the field and lab, and NSERC for funding. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Gabriel. That was really interesting. And once again, perfectly timed. Thank you to all the speakers for being really on point. All right. So let's see, first question. Is that mass of the spider or mass of the web? I presume they're asking with regard to the x-axis.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that is mass of the spider.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
And would a domed orb web like a bacillus spiders behave like 2D or 3D? Basilica, I mean, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I presume that may be a three-dimensional structure, as there'd be a height to the web. So there could be some volume to it. So I might be wrong, but I imagine that might be a three-dimensional structure.
All right, and then the question, many orb weavers eat their webs. This is less true of tangle web builders. Surely this needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it would be important to take into account the reingestion of the energy that the orb weavers are obtaining. That certainly may make a difference.
And another question, how did you measure, whoops, it keeps moving. How did you measure prey capture SA in tangle webs?
In tangle webs, we measured the height, the width and the length of the longest axis in the tangle webs. And then we measured the surface area as a cylinder, so that there was we accounted for the bottom of the cylinder and the surface area of the cylinder. That was our method.
Okay. Was it prey caught in web or prey actually consumed by spider that you used in your calculations?
We used prey caught in the web.
All right, and let's see, another question. Do you think there is a difference in spider metabolic costs and subduing prey in the different web types, with tangle webs being investment in subduing prey, whereas orb webs, the spider itself has to subdue the prey?
Yeah, I think there could definitely be differences there. I think it seems to me that their strategies for subduing prey are a lot different, and that those could entail completely different costs ultimately. Yeah.
All right. And then for one last question, despite its similarity? Do you expect any differences between web efficiency in different orb web families? For example, Aranidae versus Tetragnathidae. I'm so bad. Tetragnathidae.
It's a good question. Yeah, prior to doing the study, I did not have any expectations, and I still don't. I guess, yeah, potentially the angles that I know tetragnathids often do horizontal webs. Maybe that could influence it, and perhaps if there was some differences in the silk, or if they applied different amounts of glue to the silk or something along those lines, that could definitely potentially influence the capture efficiency of their webs.
Great, thank you, Gabriel. We're going to move on